In this presentation, we're going to have a look at Section 2 of the Fraud Act 2006, which is the offence of fraud by false representation. The actus reus, first of all, comprises of making a representation which is false. The clue is very much in the name there. The mens rea, slightly more complicated. The first element is dishonesty, as we've seen under the ghost test. Just a quick note on that. The things that aren't dishonest, as seen under the Theft Act, they don't apply here. So when we're looking at dishonesty, we're just looking at the ghost test. Also, part of the mens rea, knowing that the representation is or might be untrue or misleading, and intent to make a gain or to cause a loss. So the sad fact is that fraud by false representation is actually something that we experience almost every day. If you open up your emails, if you receive a text message off somebody that you don't know, if you receive a phone call off somebody that you don't know, it's quite possible that it could be an example of phishing, which is somebody pretending to be an organisation that you know, asking you for details. And what they're actually doing is that they're trying to get your details so that they can either steal money from you or steal your information in order to get money from elsewhere. What I want to show you is an advert made by Barclays, which is on the television at the moment, which is trying to raise awareness of this issue.
Hello, I'm David from Barclays.
He's lying.
I'm currently in the process of upgrading your account,
No, he isn't.
so I just need your full password.
No, he doesn't. It's a scam.
Once I've got that, I can send you a link to access the account.
That's also a scam. Every year, millions are lost to fraud. At Barclays, we'll never ask for your full password or PIN, so never give it out.
Thanks for your time.
At least that's true.
So if we look at what we've actually just seen there, first of all, there was a representation. He said that he was from Barclays, and it was false. He knew that he wasn't from Barclays. He acted dishonestly under the ghost test, meaning he was acting in a way that the reasonable man would see as being dishonest, and he knew that he was acting a way that the reasonable man would term as dishonest. He knew that his representation was false, and by making that representation, he intended to make a gain by accessing the person's bank account or by using their information to buy goods. And there's also the intent to cause a loss to the person who provides the security details. So let's have a look at some case law and see how it works in the legal world. The case of Ray demonstrates that even though a representation might be true to start with, it can become false. A somewhat unfortunate case in my opinion. In this case, the defendant applied to Birmingham City Council for a grant to modify his house in order to help his mother, who was disabled. The grant was approved, but just before the work started, his mother died. The defendant failed to inform the council of this and used the grant money to carry out the modifications to his house. And the court viewed his conduct as a continuing representation that his mother was still alive and therefore was in need of these modifications. Although the representation was true when it was made, it became false once the mother died, and therefore he was guilty of fraud by false representation. MPC and Charles. This is a case that may or may not mean very much to you. The picture on the screen at the moment is actually of a cheque guarantee card. On debit and some credit cards, there used to be a little holographic strip which guaranteed that a cheque that you wrote against this card would be honoured, and that's all it was. So if you went to a shop and you had to write a cheque, you wouldn't just give them the cheque, you'd also give them the cheque guarantee card as well. And it was a promise that the bank would honour up to the value on the cheque guarantee card. it did mean that most of these cheque guarantee cards were for around about £100, fairly low amounts of money. But it did mean that even if you handed over a cheque for £500, all that your bank was guaranteeing was the amount on the cheque guarantee card, which usually wasn't very much. These don't exist anymore. There's one or two, I would guess, still in circulation. But there was always the issue of somebody showed you this little holograph. What were you going to do with it then? So they fell out of fashion. But let's have a look what happened with MPC and Charles. So our defendant wrote out a series of cheques and supported them with a cheque guarantee card. And he used these cheques in order to buy gambling chips at a casino. It was implied that he had the authority to do this, and it was assumed that the casino wouldn't have accepted the cheques had they not been guaranteed by the cheque guarantee card. And had the truth been known that actually the defendant was exceeding his overdraft, the casino never would have accepted these cheques. So by presenting the cheque with the cheque guarantee card, the defendant was representing that he had enough money in his bank account to pay, and therefore that was a false representation. So let's have a look at representations for a moment. Essentially, anything goes with representations. They can be written, they can be spoken, they can be posted on a website, they can be over the telephone, they can be through an email, whatever it might be. And they can also be implied by conduct. So Barnard, this is a very old case, wore a false uniform, pretended to work for a university when actually he didn't. He was making a false representation. Lambie, using a credit card without authority. By having a credit card and by knowing the PIN number, if that's the way that you're going to use it, you are representing that you have the authority to use that credit card. And DPP and Ray, 1973, this is an important case for you. Our defendant ordered a meal not intending to pay for it. Now, by going into the restaurant, by sitting down, by ordering the meal, our defendant is representing the fact that he is going to pay, because that's obviously the agreed conduct. You don't have to go into a restaurant and say, I would like to see the menu, and by the way, I'm going to pay for my dinner. Nobody does that. You implicitly show that by going in and ordering food. Now, a lot of the cases that we are looking at are under the old law. And there is quite a lot of similarity with the old law, so they are still relevant. And they can be used as guidance where appropriate. So you might see some case law which predates the new law, but that's still okay. So what does a representation include? We've covered quite a lot of those, but let's just have a look. Saying you own something that you don't. Saying a car has done fewer miles than it actually has. Saying that you're going to pay a bill but having no intention to do so. Using a false ID. Putting a fake coin into a slot machine. Submitting a false claim. Providing a false reference. Phishing, as we talked about at the start. Wearing a fake uniform. Or offering a fake credit card to pay for goods are all representations. So actually the idea of making a representation is quite a wide concept. Let's have a look now at the mens rea of the offence. As I said before, the first ingredient is dishonesty, as in the Gauche test. You've got the objective and subjective part. The objective part being, would the defendant's conduct be regarded as dishonest by the standards set by reasonable and honest people? And also the subjective element. If that is the case, was the defendant aware that his conduct would be regarded as dishonest by reasonable and honest people? So the last two sections of the mens rea. First of all, the defendant has to know that the representation is or might be untrue or misleading. And also, he has to make this representation with the intention to make a gain or to cause a loss to another. Once again, the gain or loss must be of money or other property. And again, it can be a temporary gain or loss. But because this is a mens rea element, no actual gain or loss needs to be suffered or made. The representation just has to be made in the hope that this is what's going to happen for the defendant. So for example, they go to the restaurant without paying. They have every intention that they're not going to pay. They get up to leave, and on their way out they're met with the waiter who demands the money, and they dutifully pay up and leave. They could still be guilty of fraud by false representation because they've satisfied all of the requirements. It doesn't actually matter that they didn't make a gain or the restaurant didn't suffer a loss. So to finish up on section 2, I'd like to show you a short scenario, and what I'd really like you to do at this point is we're going to read through it together, and then I'd like you to stop the video, I'd like you to look over your notes, and I would like you to write a short answer as to whether or not our defendant Alice could be guilty of fraud by false representation. So the scenario is this. Alice used her credit card to buy some clothes, but she knew that she had already exceeded the credit limit on the card. So pause the video and see if you can write an answer. So hopefully you've done it properly and you've paused the video and you've now got an answer. This is my suggested answer for you. So Alice made, by an implied representation, that she has the authority to use the card, which is false, as in Lambie. She also knows that it is false. It is likely that she is seen as dishonest by ordinary people under the gauche test. It's irrelevant whether the false representation is believed or not by the assistant. Alice intends to gain the clothes, and again, it doesn't matter whether she succeeds or not. So actually, by taking the clothes up to the counter, presenting the card as payment, knowing that she has exceeded her credit limit, she is guilty of the offence, even if the card is declined and she leaves without the clothes. So, for that reason, Alice is likely to be found guilty of Section 2, fraud by false representation.